G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we are going through my race week preview and final thoughts ahead of the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you're new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. So as is the case with these videos, I look at all the key talking points in the lead up to the race, chip strategy and team selection dilemmas, and then towards the end of the video we'll revisit kind of where my team is at heading into the race week. First thing I want to cover off in this video are the upcoming RB upgrades for Jeddah. There's been reports that they are going to bring an upgrade for the VCARB 01, not a large package by any means, but a tweak to the aerodynamic designs with the car as it stands. After disappointing results in Bahrain, I think they're obviously going to try and roll out some of these upgrades sooner in the season than maybe anticipated. But I think based on what we saw last season with the AlphaTauri outfit, bringing through a number of successful upgrades that resulted in a number of points finishes for both Tsunoda and Ricciardo in that second half. So if they're able to replicate anything like that this go around, hopefully they're able to rebound from a pretty disappointing outing in the first race week of the season. There was obviously a lot of optimism and expectations for this team, especially after the encouraging signs we saw in preseason testing, and then Ricciardo obviously putting in that P1 in free practice 1 in Bahrain. But obviously from what we saw in the race, just wasn't able to keep up with some of the other teams in the midfield, namely the Saubers. Both Bottas and Zhou qualified quite low, and Zhou in particular made some great progress through the field, outpacing both Tsunoda and Ricciardo over that race distance. And even the Haas seemed to have a lot more pace there than what most of us probably expected. And I think what stood out to me was in particular Tsunoda and Ricciardo trying to make that pass on Magnussen in the dying stages of the race and just weren't able to capitalize. So obviously not a great sign, and I'm not saying the Haas is by any means a world-beating team, but the fact that they were able to keep that distance from Tsunoda and Ricciardo behind just meant that maybe the RB is not quite up to scratch, or at least not at the level that we might have expected at this stage of the season. Now, I mentioned the upgrades before and how well they were deployed last season. If they are able to make some strides with developing the car in the first few races, then maybe they'll be able to put in a few more consistent performances as we progress. But as of right now, it just seems like they're stuck in the midfield. And I really want to see a bit more from them. I, for one, own RB as the constructor and also have Ricciardo in my team. So I do want to see some encouraging signs from them in free practice at Jeddah. And if it just doesn't look like they've got their act together by this second race, and I know it's a very quick turnaround 1 week, but if they seem a little off the pace there, then I may be forced into making a drastic change to my team for Saudi Arabia. But I'm not by any means, until I see free practice, deciding to make knee-jerk trades. It just wasn't an encouraging sign for these guys after a lot of hype in the first race, in preseason, in the lead up to the first race of the season. Now, Ferrari performance across the entire race weekend was particularly fascinating for me. There was a lot of speculation and expectation for the Scuderia that they would be Red Bull's closest rival heading into Bahrain, and it very much proved to be the case. Even though Sainz, for instance, struggled through practice on Thursday, he made some great changes to the car overnight and meant he ended up topping free practice 3 on the Friday. So a great final practice session really put a bow on the lead up to qualifying. And both Sainz and Leclerc had very strong qualifying performances. Leclerc just missed out on pole position to Max Verstappen and then started the race but just seemed to struggle a little bit with the car. He was wrestling the car through a number of turns, came off the track several times, and also encountered brake issues. So not a great sign for someone who's been dogged by bad luck and inconsistent reliability problems throughout his career, certainly with Ferrari. Sainz, on the other hand, he showed exceptionally good pace. I was quite impressed by some of the passes he made, especially that one on his teammate. And ultimately, that race performance contributed to that P3 and that driver of the day result for him as well. So for those fantasy strategists that boldly pick Carlos Sainz in their team for the first race of the season, a just reward for that. But going back to Leclerc, he lost, from what I understand, an estimated 0.6 per lap through the opening stint of the race. That ultimately meant he lost position and finished P4. And I don't think P3 and P4 is by any means a bad result for Ferrari. It was very much expected Red Bull would be very strong out of the gates, and they certainly demonstrated that. Perez in particular, who qualified P5, made some great made great progress and made his way through the field to obviously end up P2. And I think for a lot of people, that was kind of the expectation heading into Bahrain. So P3 and P4, I don't think Ferrari should be disheartened by that too much. And I certainly think that the SF24 is a much better car than what the team was running 12 months ago. I think it's a little bit more versatile, and they've said that it's going to be a bit more adaptable with new upgrades. On the topic of that, it is expected that Ferrari are going to bring a new rear wing specification. It is much less of an emphasis on downforce at Jeddah because of how high performance and how fast paced the track is. So I think Ferrari is a team to watch heading into practice and beyond in this weekend. In terms of kind of what that means for fantasy and your lineups, I'll be covering them in particular towards the end of the video. Another team that crossed my radar last weekend was Haas. Now, I think a lot of people understandably had them at the bottom of their list, myself included, heading into the new season. A new team principal, a car that very much ran at the back of the field for most of last season. There was not a lot of cause for optimism for the American outfit. And Magnussen, qualified P15, Hulk P10. Pretty sound outcome. There was just a lot of concerns for their race pace, as was the case last season. Tyre degradation, long run performance just didn't seem to work in Haas's favour 12 months ago. And this time, if we look at how they were this time last year, the bar coming into Bahrain was lower than the depths of hell. And quite honestly, was expecting very much the same, even given heading into the first race of the season. Sauber and Alpine were also not looking so great. I'll get onto those guys in a second, but Magnussen and Hulk, I think P15 and P10, very much representative of how they went last season in qualifying. And then obviously when it got to the race day, a completely different story where their car would just fall off a cliff. Interestingly enough, Kevin Magnussen ended up P12, and as I pointed out before, was able to hold off those RBs chasing behind him. Hulk unfortunately regressed a little bit, P16, starting from P10 on the grid, but obviously got caught up in that first turn incident as well. So unfortunately for Hulk, he was the lowest scoring driver of the weekend in fantasy terms of -3. Magnussen, however, came away with 7 points. So a very decent outing for him, given how underwhelming he was last season, and there wasn't a lot of hype in relation to him heading into this year either. Magnussen tied with Alonso and Ocon for 7 points apiece. So he also experienced a 0.5 million price increase. Pretty handy for someone at that price point. Unfortunately, Ocon, his teammate Gasly, who scored 1 point less than Magnussen and Ocon, went down 0.2. And the pricing has been factored in from the very beginning of the season, both increases and decreases, which we didn't really see until halfway through last year. I'm just fascinated and quite bamboozled by the fact that Gasly went down 0.2 despite scoring only 1 point less than Ocon and Magnussen. So price increases kind of makes my mind boggle a little bit, but hopefully we get a bit more clarity on that and kind of how that is tied to race results for both drivers and constructors as we move through the season. I guess looking at Hülkenberg and Magnussen in a vacuum, I think I still like Hülkenberg. I know Magnussen obviously had a much better fantasy outing, but I think at 6.2 million, the only driver price cheaper than him is Logan Sargent. I think that's very good value, if I'm being completely honest. I saw a lot more from Hulk to suggest he is far and away the better driver than K-Mag from last season, and unfortunately his 2023 was dogged by that terrible race pace and tyre degradation, which it looks like they've fixed heading into this season. So I'm quite optimistic on both K-Mag and Hülkenberg, but I think if I had to choose between the two, I much like Hülkenberg. Certainly for someone like if you're swapping him out, just making one trade to your team this weekend, I think Bottas is probably someone you could move Hülkenberg in for. I still think Bottas has something to offer, but just seems to be undone by a lot of bad luck at the moment, or even maybe a Williams driver. If you think Albon and Sargent are going to struggle in Jeddah, then Hülkenberg potentially could be a really reliable and solid alternative certainly. So as I said, if they're able to consistently maintain that race pace performance like they had in Bahrain, which they didn't have 12 months ago, then I certainly think Haas could be sneaky steals at kind of that $6 to $7 million price bracket. Want to quickly cover off chip strategy before I pick my team up one more time for this week. With every race, we'll cover off kind of the relevant chips to consider heading into any given race week. And I think, as was the case last week and even this week, there isn't really much of a need to deploy too many chips at this early stage of the season. There's still a lot we need to find out about drivers and constructors. And I tend to neglect my chips, at least until we have a much clearer idea of kind of fantasy value, the landscape, the template, and price increases and decreases. But the reason why no negative for me comes onto the radar is just because it is the fastest street track on the calendar. Up until last year, it averaged 5.5 DNFs per race. And I know we've only raced there 3 times, but it's still something to keep in mind, especially because it is a track that doesn't seem to forgive too easily. But I did point out on Twitter during the week that there has been a number of new safety measures introduced to the street circuit at Jeddah. So that seems to have rectified a number of the concerns around certain turns and essentially decreased top speeds in certain parts of the track as well. So given those changes were rolled out in 2022 and 2023, it's clearly reflective of the DNF rate in 2023, that drop off from kind of around 5.6 to 2. I'm interested to see whether or not those safety measures are going to consistently replicate the low attrition rate we saw last season. It may not be, it may be, but we've seen some more inexperienced drivers like Schumacher, Latifi, etc. struggle at Jeddah. I'm looking at drivers like Logan Sargent, for instance, as one that may, even though he emerged relatively unscathed last year, may run into some trouble, particularly in a car that is typically going to be struggling at the back. So if he's someone that's going to push the car a bit too much, take the odd risk or two just to break through those lower qualifying or practice times, could end up putting the car on the wall. So just monitor that. In terms of other chips, wouldn't really think about using any others at this stage of the season. I myself, among with several others, might be on the back foot, but it's definitely not panic station. So I would not entertain the idea of using your 3 times, your Limitless, or any other chips like that. Even for wildcard, I think it's maybe 1 to 2 races too early if you've really got cold feet. Like myself, maybe bear with your team for another week or 2, and if it looks terrible by the time we get to Australia, Japan, China, then think about deploying the wildcard. But I think the no negative is really the only chip right now that comes into play because of kind of the risk factor that comes with a street circuit like Saudi Arabia. So I'll quickly pick my team up one more time before the race week arrives. As I mentioned, RB is not really a team that seems to be delivering as much as what I expected, and I'm trying to be patient to a certain extent. Given the fact that I still don't know if we know the true potential of the RB, but at the same time, when you're seeing constructors like Ferrari and Mercedes consistently deliver, or at least deliver in the first race week of the season, if that continues over the next few weeks, every week I put that off is no doubt going to set me back further. So I'm looking at potentially eyeing off a Ferrari constructor build with Perez, maybe the Ferrari Mercedes constructor combination with Max at the 2 times, or even potentially Aston Martin in that second slot, which I'm not so keen on, but really requires a bit of forward planning to get to a point where I'm able to make a judgment call on one of those 3 potential builds. Now, how my team's currently set up, and I know it's all very team dependent, as cliche as that expression is for your fantasy teams, it requires a certain part of forward planning over the next couple of weeks to get to, say, a Mercedes Ferrari or a Red Bull Ferrari with Perez at the 2 times. Now, the Red Bull Ferrari Perez paid off handsomely in Bahrain. Anyone that took that risk, kudos to you guys, because that was the meta build in the first race week of the season. For me, I'm still a big believer that Max Verstappen over an entire season is going to be more consistent than rotating a Perez, a Leclerc, a Hamilton, etc. in that spot. So if I'm potentially moving towards a lineup of, say, a Ferrari Mercedes or a Red Bull Ferrari Perez in week 2, I'd look at freeing up budget in this week and ultimately roll the second transfer. So for me, the slot that makes the most sense is Stroll, not because he had a bad fantasy outing, but just because he is the highest priced driver outside of Verstappen in my team. And on any given day, I can really see Ricciardo, Albon, Bottas or Stroll scoring similar unless, of course, there are situations outside of our control or outside of our purview that would result in, say, Stroll having a better than expected fantasy result. So Tsunoda for me would just give me a little bit more budget flexibility heading into Australia. So this could hypothetically be my team in, say, Saudi Arabia. You could put Joe in there. You could put Gasly in there, because Gasly, Ocon, if they continue to qualify quite poorly, there's positions gains and overtakes to pick up there if they're, P19, P20 like we saw in Bahrain. Let's say we rock up to Australia like this. I've got 3 trades in hand, and I need to figure out at that point, with a second week's worth of information on which drivers and constructors are the best, what the template's kind of moving in the direction of. And I think it gives me a bit more flexibility to pivot between a different lineup with 3 trades up my sleeve. So hypothetically, when we get to Australia, I could get RB and Red Bull out and bring in an easy switch Ferrari and Mercedes. Now, I know 0.5 million maybe doesn't give me enough breathing room in the case of value changes for drivers and constructors. So if in the off chance I get to this point and Ricciardo I haven't got enough cost cap, then Ricciardo potentially becomes a makeshift swap for someone else in that kind of price bracket. I mentioned Joe. If by the second race Alpine looked terrible and continually qualify poor, but just seem to pick up a couple of points when other drivers ahead of them DNF, then they could be an option. Kind of anyone in that $7 to $8 million price bracket seems okay. I know Haas, maybe if you're really stretched on budget, could be an option too. So there's plenty of flexibility there. Let's say if I reset my team back to what I had in Saudi Arabia, assuming Tsunoda makes the cut after a suboptimal race in Bahrain, we've got Ricciardo. I wish it was a bit more intuitive than having to reset it. But let's say we get to Australia again, like this team, and instead of Ferrari Mercedes as the 1-2 constructor punch, it looks as though Perez or Leclerc in that 2 times slot seems to be better value, in which case you'd keep Red Bull racing to cover Max Verstappen's output, given he is a guaranteed 30 to 40 points most race weeks. So you drop him off, you'd bin off again RB in my case. Some of you might have Aston Martin if that's the kind of lineup you're rolling with. And then if Ferrari can continually look like the second best constructor, the clear-cut number 2 behind Red Bull from what we saw in Bahrain, then they would come in here. As I mentioned, Perez, for instance, could come in here with that race pace. That's another easy 2 trades off the bat there. I've got a little bit of budget. I could certainly move Bottas up to someone like a Joe, maybe a Gasly, move an Albon down to a Hülkenberg type thing. There's a lot of different options, but I think rolling 1 trade, assuming RB don't look completely out of their depths in practice in Saudi Arabia, and then having that flexibility financially and structurally in your team come Australia, just means you're able to pivot and use that information we've learned over 2 weeks as opposed to a much smaller sample size in one to make those decisions. Because I think by that point, 2 weeks, we'll have a much clearer idea of kind of where the lay of the land is for drivers and constructors. Now, I mentioned Aston Martin as well. I think I'm probably less keen on them. I know Alonso has a huge X factor in that team, and more often than not is going to score the bulk of the points for them. But for Stroll, it's just such an unpredictable variable, and he does have great races in him sometimes, and other times he just doesn't. And I think that's the difference between a 15 to 20 point constructor performance from Aston Martin and a 40 to 50 point constructor performance. So you kind of know what to expect from Alonso, but it's Stroll that really is the unknown there. And I think you're getting a bit more consistency in a Red Bull racing outfit where Verstappen's always going to be number one more often than not. A Perez that could be anywhere between P2 and P4, and then Ferrari, I think they've got a much better car than they did 12 months ago. So I really like this lineup build, but obviously by no means settled on it. If it really gets to practice and Ferrari are the dominant outfit from the outset and Red Bull are up there too, I may take a -10. I'm not saying I want to in the second race of the season, and I said that I wouldn't put myself in this position this early on. But again, I don't want to, if it gets to a point where Ferrari do look like the team to beat outside of Red Bull. I don't want to set myself back a further week with budget and such. So I'll just play it as it comes with practice. But I think the intent right now would be to use one transfer, roll the second one into Australia, and have 3 transfers available to have a bit more flexibility and a bit more information to make those decisions. But that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it, guys. I will be back on FanAmp for a deadline live stream over on their YouTube channel. The details for that are in the description below, so check their YouTube channel out. We've done our race week preview as well, so lots more information for you to dissect there, including our winners and losers for Bahrain and in the lead up to Saudi Arabia. And I'm also going to be on Twitter quite actively as well, leading up to Jeddah. So lots of information to dissect. I've also got my league code in the description below, so join that. It's also on the screen here, but I know some people have had difficulties differentiating between the 0 and the O, I think, in the league code. So an auto join link is in the description below. But I'll leave it all there for now, guys. I appreciate you dropping by. Good luck with your teams, and I'll see you all very soon.